Well, hello everyone, it's John Laughland here. Welcome to this week's forum. I'm the director of Forum for Democracy International. We're delighted to be joined this week. My co-host and I are delighted to welcome this week as our guest Simon Elmer. Simon Elmer has been on the forum a couple of times before. He's the author of The Great Replacement and the Islamization of Britain. He's also a former academic, and we're going to be talking about academics today, in particular about Jason Arday and the Jason Arday affair. He was a visiting professor at the University of Michigan and at University College London, where he taught history and the Simon, thanks very much for coming back on. In the Jason Arday affair, which for those of our listeners and viewers who may not know, concerns a young or relatively young of Cambridge who over recent years and then much more recently in an avalanche was accused of various inventions, various lies, various acts of plagiarism. I think the story goes back to 2024 when the first allegations arose, but they snowballed in August, and he at first resigned and then committed suicide. And his showed not just that he was a fantasist and, to put it bluntly, a liar, but also that the University of Cambridge and no doubt many other academic institutions were taken in. And they were taken in. Why? Well, because he was the perfect woke person. He ticked all the boxes. He was black. He claimed to have been autistic and unable to speak until the age of 11. He claimed he couldn't read until the age of 18 and all this kind of stuff. He claimed to have run 6 marathons in 6 days, whatever. So it's an extraordinary affair which tells us a lot about academia, a lot about British academia, Western academia in general. Tells us a lot probably about psychology, both his psychology, the psychology of a fantasist, but also, of course, the psychology of the people who recruited him. Anyway, in the wake of this affair, Simon, you posted a couple of posts that attracted my attention. The first one, at least I think it was the first one I saw, starts, the average in South Africa is 68. Out of 49 countries, 10 have average IQs below 60, indicating feeble-minded is a phrase we haven't really heard, I don't think, as far as I know. You write this, Simon, as the response to the suicide of Jason Arday has shown, African people are essentially pack animals. That's not only because in historical terms they were the last packs, whether that's the savannas of Africa or the streets of Baltimore. Simon, when you wrote those to say these days, what moved you to write this? Simon.
Hello, John. Thank you for having me back on the show. You sort of started a little bit at the end of this series of posts I've been writing recently.
Okay.
The first one was about the Jason Arday case,
yes,
as I called it, and we'll get onto that, obviously. But I think I was very surprised that the response I had to all these posts, which made me write more, wasn't so much the backlash that I expected. I mean, you can tell that I'm no longer in academia, because if I'd written anything like that, I would have been fired immediately.
Yeah.
What I actually received was an enormously, overwhelmingly positive response from other people. And the thing that they said, and obviously this is in the context of the kind of the response on both sides to the Jason Arday case, was that thank God that someone is finally talking about what all of us believe. I imagine that's why you've got me on here as well.
Definitely.
So certainly there were some people coming back and accusing me of the usual thing of being racist and all that sort of stuff. But the overwhelming response was a positive one. It was finally we can kind of talk about this. And I think that's, for me, why the Jason Arday case is so interesting.
Yeah.
It's not only about academia, although it certainly is. And we'll talk about what has happened to academia and why, in particular, someone like him, who is not merely a serial liar and a fantasist, but a criminal, in my opinion. We can talk about why I think he is. I think it's clear that he was guilty of fraud, and he chose to commit suicide rather than face, if indeed he would face in the UK's legal system, the consequences of his crimes, but also that this spreads a lot across the whole of the UK state and indeed into the private sector as well. It's generally known as DEI, which stands for diversity, equity, and inclusivity. In the UK, it's called EDI, which is simply the kind of a different order of that. But what makes it interesting for me, because I'm not particularly interested in academia per se, now that I've left it, is that there is a Jason Arday in every institution, or Jason Ardays in every institution in the UK, in our parliaments, in our civil service, in our civic bodies, in the Mayor of London's office, in our, amongst our MPs, everywhere we go. And I think
when you say there's a Jason Arday in every one of these institutions, are you saying a specifically diversity DEI or EDI person, or a fantasist?
No, his fantasies don't really concern me so much. If he was simply,
well, when I say fantasist, I mean liar.
Well, yes, his lies definitely concern me, because when you elevate, as we have done, people who are unqualified, whatever qualifications they may have been given, but unqualified to perform those roles. And there are, later on, I'll go in and talk about some of the people who are in those roles, who are given authority over the British people because they are, in the nomenclature of today, EDI hires. They've been hired for reasons in excess of any qualifications they have. That is very serious. There's a lot of people have been defrauded by Jason Arday, other academics, people who didn't get the jobs, people who didn't get the funding, people who didn't get the book deals, the British people themselves who pay to have him educated when that money should have gone to someone else. But the real people who've been defrauded by him are the students themselves.
Yeah, of course.
Now, several thousand students must have gone through his teaching, or at least his classes, and they paid a lot of money to do it. He went through a lot of very good institutions. He went from, he was in Durham University, Glasgow, he went to Cambridge. At Cambridge, as a full professor, he would have been earning in excess of £100,000 a year. It's a lot of money. And the students paying to go there are paying a lot of money. Even in the humanities, by the end of the degree, they would have paid in excess of 30,000. If they were overseas students, they would have paid £25,000 or something like that per year. So we're talking about enormous amount of money that either they have taken on as a debt or their parents have paid, and they haven't received an education. Now that he's been outed, students have been coming out and saying, yes, we complained about his teaching. And they were simply met with the same way that the reporters who tried to out him as dead, they were accused of racism, that the only reason that anyone could be opposed to this man was because they were a racist.
Yes, I forgot to say in my introduction that the story, there are so many stories within the story, but the worst one is the one you've just, and I forgot to say it, but in fact it's the most important, is that he set the police on people who were asking him questions. In the first case, I believe, a absolutely kosher journalist saying, I'm checking up on your plagiarism allegations. And he set the police on that. He set the police on that person accusing him of harassment.
And did the police go to that person?
Yes, there was a 4-month inquest into this man. I've forgotten the journalist's name, but yes, I mean that is one of the many, many shocking.
And that's why I think it's kind of, I don't like the idea of him as a fantasist. If he was simply a fantasist, if he was someone who was a liar, someone who was a kind of a con man, that would be one thing. That would be bad enough. But he wasn't. He was supported by the entire UK state.
Yes.
Well, then
educational, but also the
but then who's
the
the con man?
Well, he is undoubtedly a con man.
No, but if the institutions of the state are supporting him, ultimately it's the state itself that is the con man.
Absolutely. That's why his case is so interesting, because it shines a light through the whole of the UK state, way beyond the kind of the educational institutions. I mean, he was awarded a senior lectureship at his first university, where was it? It was Roehampton, wasn't it? And he hadn't even published a single article at the time. And he went to senior lecture. My wife is a senior lecturer, and she was, it's her whole career. She's a sort of an associate professor. That's a year. Within 5 years, he'd gone to Cambridge. He went through, I think, 4 or 5 different universities, really senior universities, Glasgow, Durham, and Cambridge in 5 years, and to a full professorship. Now, I imagine all of us have got some experience in academia. I think we all do, don't we? We
Yes.
know that is impossible. There's only
Yeah.
one person who could do that, and that is someone like Wittgenstein, someone who is acknowledged as an absolute genius. We're just going to put him up to
I
full.
think Jeffrey Sachs did that.
Okay, you have to be someone who has got
But he is brilliant.
Okay, you need to be someone with an absolute, a global reputation, producing, kind of books that will change. The books he published were sort of self-help books.
Yeah.
They were things that focused on pop songs. I imagine
Yeah.
that's because that's the only kind of culture he came into contact with. He was quite obviously a fraud. But what I'm saying is, and he was a con man, but he couldn't have got as far as he did unless the institutions themselves
Absolutely.
were complicit in this fraud. In my opinion, the students, but also other lecturers as well, who were passed over for grants and so on, for publications, but the students above all should get together and bring a kind of a class case against these institutions which have defrauded them out of a genuine education. For the rest of their life, every time they go for a job, especially if it's a job in academia, people will say, "Oh, did you study under Jason Arday?" They've lost their education forever. They've lost that forever. So it's not just the money they've lost, they've also lost their education. And this accords with, fraud is defined in the UK under the Fraud Act 2006. If someone lies about their qualifications, if they try to deceive someone else or withhold information, and they do it to the benefit of themselves or the loss of others, they are guilty of fraud. So yes, he was a liar. Yes, he was a fantasist, but he was above all a criminal.
Yeah, but Simon, you're talking about, we're all talking about very prestigious positions. Like you said, all three of us here have been in academia and we all have our own stories. But I have to hope at least there has to be some form of vetting, but he was put in a position where he could not be vetted. He was a protected person. I mean, we all know that that's not what academia is all about. So again, I mean, a fabulist, a liar, a con man, but I mean, who's going to be held responsible for it? The man took his own life. That is unfortunate, but it shouldn't stop there. Who signed off on all of these positions? Aren't they going to be investigated for this fraud?
When I started writing about this, someone came back to me who was very against what I was saying, and she said, "You're talking rubbish. You cannot discriminate." Because I was saying that he's been a beneficiary of positive discrimination, and she said, "You can't discriminate in the UK under the Equalities Act 2010. You cannot discriminate people based on a whole series of protected characteristics, which includes race." And I said, "Yes. Isn't that interesting? So how was it done?" And it's done through EDI. The interesting thing about equality, diversity, and equity, diversity, inclusivity, is that it hasn't run through any act of parliament. It's not written into any law.
Yeah.
It is above the law. And yet what we've seen, or I know it anyway, we know this because we investigate and write about this stuff. But what people are seeing now is that this criteria has been written into every level of the state. It's written into our laws. It's written into our police in particular, which I find absolutely horrifying. There is absolutely no doubt that the police, when confronted with an accusation against a reporter for investigating a African or a black professor, they have been told the principle of equity is that the only reason that an African or a Muslim or a transsexual or any other protected characteristic under the Equality Act, a person with these protected characteristics, commits more crimes than someone who is not protected, who is not in possession of those characteristics, is because the institutions that compose the UK state are systematic, what do they go, structurally racist or homophobic or Islamophobic and so on and so forth. So they've been given by the Police Council, isn't it? I think it was in May 2025 last year. There's a new set of procedures, which means they need to balance up the arrests, and not simply arrests, but investigations and so forth, to make sure that there is equity between the people with protected characteristics or unprotected characteristics, so that all Muslims, all black people, all transsexuals, or whatever it is, or any protected characteristic, if you're gay or whatever it is, a woman, they all have to level up, because that is what equity means. Equity means equity of outcome. Yeah. And this has been extended across everything now.
Everything.
And that is a very dangerous thing, because it means we no longer live in a society which is based on trying to make the best people do the best things. Now, we all know
Meritocracy.
a meritocracy, that's the word I'm looking for. Now, we all know that we all don't come from the same backgrounds. Jason Arday, like myself, came from a working class background. And it's right that people from those backgrounds are given, for instance, grants to get through their, they don't have rich parents to pay them to, go take 3 years off and go and do a study. So they will receive a grant or something like that. This is good. We try to change and equal up, give equity to people. You're never going to change everything because people come from very, very different backgrounds. There are lots of differences between them. But trying to simply make the equal outcomes is different from giving people an equality or a near equality of basis.
Yeah, that's allowing for an equitable outcome, but not determining it in advance. Okay, it's equality of opportunity.
Yes,
I think exactly. In the case of in the Jason Arday case, if I can partly answer Peter's question, yes, there will be an inquiry. Cambridge University is launching an inquiry, an internal inquiry into how this happened. We'll see how far it goes. Obviously, the Department of Education, which was the department that recruited him, must have responsibility, but he was recruited by people also outside that department. That department, I think, will come into focus because it's got a lot of very questionable people in it. And there's a famous video, you may not have seen it, Peter, of the head of that department, a woman called Hilary Kremin, I think, Professor Kremin, welcoming Jason Arday. It's filmed on the BBC, and she's clearly in love with him in a way. She is absolutely, she's so excited to have him, and she says, "You are the best in the world." And it's an absolutely ridiculous moment, not least because Arday himself, in his demeanor, was very, how can I put it? He was rather sort of gay. He had big brown eyes. He sort of stared like a doe. And I'm sure he did charm a lot of, let's be frank, a lot of middle-aged ladies. He wasn't like some black men are, rather aggressive, or he was on the contrary, very, very soft and gentle. And as I say, rather doe-eyed. But, and indeed, we'll see what Cambridge comes up with. But what my feeling is that, and this is, I think, where Simon is going to go as well, is that even if they say, yes, Professor Kremin or whatever she was called, and the other members of the jury were at fault and they didn't look in and we have to have better procedures and so on, what this throws up is not just DEI rules, not just, but something much worse than that, an absolute impulse, as she expressed, towards pushing people. They're not being pushed, if you like, these people. They want to have the diversity.
Yeah, but see, John, doesn't that beg the point that she wasn't in love with him? She was in love with the idea.
Absolutely, of him. Yeah. Sorry, Simon.
But what does that tell us about her?
Well, it tells us obviously about her individually, but in my view, and I'm sure Simon...
Well, that mindset, let's say.
Exactly. It's a mindset. That's what Simon said a moment ago, and I'd be very interested if you could develop that, Simon. You say there's someone like him everywhere. There are people like him everywhere. This isn't just the Department of Education at the University of Cambridge. Go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, we all know that recently there was that, there was another case, if you like, of the, what's his name, George Aberonier. He's the former president of the Oxford Union.
Yes.
Another black boy who, it turned out, got into PPE, politics, philosophy, economics, without the marks that were required to get in. I think there was some woman who was kind of saying, well, hold on, my daughter didn't get in there. She had higher marks than you, but you didn't get in. So he's obviously been pushed ahead. And he turned out to be someone who debated Charlie Kirk, I think shortly before he was killed, and then celebrated afterwards. He's another Jason Arday. You've got David Lammy. I've been following David Lammy, who was he was the former Deputy Prime Minister, and also the former Secretary of State for Justice, who was removed jury trials. He's a very peculiar guy that I've followed for many years. He's a very low IQ kind of person. He went on Mastermind a little while ago, and he came out with a whole series of very amusing answers. He thought Marie Antoinette was a scientist. He thought the Palace of Versailles was a prison, that Henry VII succeeded Henry VIII, and all this sort of stuff. And yet he's risen to one of the, the highest offices in the land. Diane Abbott is another one, her famous speech about, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of people who have been elevated by DI criteria to positions which they should not be holding. And most importantly, they're positions of authority over us. And I find that very worrying. let me go back to what you raised before, because this is a very contentious issue, and I imagine this is what you put me on here to talk about, and that is IQ quotas.
Yeah.
In my last book, which is about, I looked at the effect of Islam as an ideology on the IQ populations under its power. And if you look at it, it brings down populations which are in Muslim majority countries, particularly in Muslim Islamic states, the IQ is driven down by about 10 points, 10 to 15 points. It's very, very high. We understand why. It's quite obvious. Thinking that the summit of all knowledge and the totality of all knowledge is a book written by an Arab warlord in the 7th century up a mountain is going to, is going to decline intelligence and development of intelligence. Keeping women, 50% of the population, at home, and in the worst Islamic states, barring them from education, is also going to have an effect on that. But what I was interested in there is the effect, the negative effect of Islam on a population, and why our own country is embracing it. Why we're embracing an ideology which cretinizes.
Yes,
that's I think the correct word, cretinizes the population. But in doing that, I also looked at a lot of foreign countries, which of course themselves, a lot of them are Islam, or at least have Muslim majority countries as well, like Nigeria. And I began to look at the average IQs in sub-Saharan Africa. And as you said, they are remarkably low. The average is 68, but across some of the countries, they're extremely low indeed. Now, IQ is generally thought to be determined by 4 elements. Environmental ones, such as health, access to health, the health of the individual growing up, nutrition when you're growing up, a healthy body, blah, blah, blah. Access to education itself, with the emphasis on critical thinking. It's not being simply taught rote, but also on critical thinking. And the 4th one, even though it's very unpopular to say it these days, and even can get you fired, or even worse, arrested, is genetics.
Yeah.
Particularly the way that genetics interacts with your environment. Now, the woke idea, which is a very new idea, and I'm happy to say almost the entire of the rest of the world don't believe in it, is that race doesn't exist. Now, race does exist, of course.
Yeah.
It's the inheritance of our genetics and our environment in our DNA. I think because sports science at the moment has developed, to a great degree. There's so much money in sports now, and we're producing sportsmen where every element of that sportsman is kind of investigated and analysed. And I'm kind of into my rugby a little bit, and rugby coaches sort of say, we need to get a Fijian in because they've got these amazing genetics. They barely go to the gym, and they're immediately strong and healthy. We know that different peoples of different sizes. The body is immensely different across the world. We are incredibly different. Race is a reality. And it's obvious, and the rest of the world understands it. As you know, I've just been living in China for 3 years. They're very proud of their racial background, and they've got to, they have a very racialist, if you like, understanding of the world and the difference between peoples being founded in race. And yet, for some reason, the woke have decided that, whereas they'll admit that, say, Ethiopians are better long-distance runners, or Nigerians are stronger, or Dutch people are the tallest in the world, somehow our brains are all the same. They clearly are not. The interesting thing is they then come back to these figures, and they have 2 responses. One, because, and there's a certain element of truth in this, that because most of sub-Saharan Africa lives in very poor environmental conditions, poor access to health, nutrition, food, and so on, it's going to have an impact on their IQ. There is an element of truth that, except Africans outside of Africa, Africans in Western countries, have an average IQ of 85. That's people who've been living in the US, in Canada, in the UK, across Europe.
Well, and Simon,
often for several generations.
Yeah.
Well,
and yet
there's always that interesting example when you look at minorities in the United States, and much of what you said may or may not apply there. But if you look at Nigerians to immigrate to the United States are remarkably successful, because they don't take on the baggage of the wokeness. They don't expect that they should get some preferential treatment because of past wrongs. And it's something a lot of people, when they approach the race issue of privileged groups, Nigerians say, well, we're not privileged. We're privileged to live in America because we can be successful because the country that where we come from is extremely corrupt. And I've always found that very interesting because they don't take on the same kind of woke baggage that so many people are expected to take. So that there is an anomaly right there, and they would make the same claim. Huge population, a lot of people not having access to good health, good education, but many of those that do emigrate to Canada, the United States, come out very, very differently. So that supports your thesis of the physical environment in which you grow up. And I've met many of them, and they reject this entire legacy of slavery and being treated in lower classes. So there are anomalies. Simon, I wanted to ask you, does all of this come from America? Because it seems to be a relatively new thing in the UK. And as John has pointed out many times on this podcast, what starts in America ends up in Europe. How do you react to that?
Does what come from America? You mean woke ideology?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think it undoubtedly does. I mean, it goes back in many years. I mean, woke is the kind of the realization of a process which I think began a long time ago. I think in a way it began in the 60s, but it certainly began in the 80s with things like political correctness, multiculturalism.
Oh, I was in academia.
I was there as well. Yeah, I was there throughout the whole thing. Then identity politics and so on and so forth. And these are all imports from American universities and American or US ideologies. But let me just go back, because yes, I'm kind of more interested in the effect that different ideologies or different cultures, different ideas have on IQ levels, intelligence levels. And as I said, Islam is the one that concerns me most, because it seems that's the one which is being prepared, or not being prepared, is taking over Europe. But I think there's also something about this denial of race, of the difference between races, is very much at the heart of the DEI or the EDI idea. If you look at, even in Western countries, if your average African IQ, an African immigrant who's come there, is 85, that is very, very low. It's not a little bit lower. The average IQ of a white person in Europe or the US in the Western world is 100. 15 points is considerable. It's very, very low. It's lower than I think anywhere else in Europe. And yet this could be people who are living, like Jason Arday, people who are living in London, people who are living in New York, people who are living in some of the wealthiest places in the world.
But do we have those figures, Simon? Do we have figures for black people of African origin living as British born, maybe second or third generation? Do we have those statistics?
I imagine, well, we have generalized ones. As you can, it's very hard to kind of publish this stuff at the moment. It is published in certain journals which are interested in the relationship between genetics and intelligence. But I don't know if they've got anything. I mean, nowadays you can't even get figures broken down by race on crimes, let alone on intelligence quotient. The argument that if you take people and you put them into equal, I mean, it's a kind of a hypothetical case, equal backgrounds, equal access to education, healthcare, medicine, environments, and so on, they're all going to be the same. I don't buy that anyway. But there's another argument as well, which came out quite a lot in response to what I was saying. And that is that the testing, this I think is more indicative of the way DEI works. That is that the IQ test itself is Eurocentric, therefore white supremacist.
Yeah.
That the questions it asks favor European ways of thinking, or you could say white people, except that DEI doesn't say white people don't exist. White people don't exist in the same way that, well, black people don't exist, but we certainly don't exist. And the thing about that is, you're absolutely right. IQ tests logical reasoning, deduction, observation, critical thinking, problem solving, ability to attention spans, speed of thought, all the things that we understand by the idea of intelligence. And yes, they are European ways of thinking. We are more intelligent than the rest of the world. We have been, although China now that China has caught up with has improved its environmental conditions, its access to education, its health, its food, and so on and so forth. China now has, and most of the South, China and Japan have now actually got an average IQ of 104. They're actually above us now. But one thing's for sure, those ways of thinking give you a benefit in life. And yes, they are European ways of thinking, which is why we've dominated the world for so long, although I fear that we're not going to dominate it for much longer. So that argument goes back to the DEI things. The DEI argument that the only reason that an African or a black person is intelligent, scores so incredibly low, even in living Western countries, is because the test itself is discriminatory.
Yeah.
And that goes back to this idea of equity. Yes, Jason Arday was, from what I can tell, I've read some of his thesis, which is not only entirely plagiarized. He had the cunning to do that, to actually plagiarize a thesis. Although I know this because we all know this, students are, because of AI, plagiarism is a lot easier these days. But it's also, they're developing programs to detect it. He certainly had the cunning to do it, but anyone who would meet him, anyone who like us who've been in education, if you read the first page of his thesis, of his doctoral thesis, I supervised 2 doctorates last year, you would just throw it back and say, you talk to their supervisor and say, is this guy really doing a doctoral thesis? Maybe he's being pushed a bit too far. He's not going to pass one. So equity comes in by saying, in effect, it's saying that the measure of achievement, ability, but also suitability for the task of being a professor, a pedagogue, a lecturer, someone who's responsible for the education of our children, that a doctorate and all the other degrees that go before that themselves have to be changed. We hear these appalling things now. They're saying, well, now we're not going to make A-level students have to write essays because it discriminates against African children who can't write essays.
Yeah.
So now there's even the point having no grades at all.
Yes, I've heard that one as well.
Well, that's already real in America. That already exists in the United States. Entrance exams, the SAT, LSAT, more and more institutions are waiving them because they want to hear your story.
Yeah,
your story.
It's one way you can call it is insanity, but I think it's more than that. I think it's actually about this phrase decolonizing. Decolonizing the institution, decolonizing the program, the whole structure of education, and indeed the entire state. The worst phrase I think is we want to decolonize Shakespeare, William Shakespeare.
Yeah.
What it actually means is you want to decolonize, in our case, Britain, but across the whole West, of white people.
Yeah.
It wants to decolonize our own country of our own people. And I think if we think back to this, if we don't simply dismiss it as wokeness gone mad, but as actually part of a much bigger program, because the money behind this is enormous. The money, just now sorry, I'll finish my sentence. It is about dismantling the West. It's about dismantling this immense heritage of European civilization, the greatest civilization there's ever been. Probably.
Yeah, but it's white people doing that.
Well, they could only do it. They could only do it with our help, couldn't they? Great empires rot from within. All great empires rot from within, and we are definitely rotting. When I look at the people, after you probably heard about this, Peter, but after Jason Arday committed suicide, there was a vigil held in Trafalgar Square, our kind of main square in London, and it was attended at least by probably as many white people as it was as black people as well. Yeah. And the first person who got up to speak was a white man, and he said, "This is a day for white people to shut up." So all again and again, we're told we have nothing to say in our own country. This is a process of decolonization. Dictators have shown us in the past that it only takes a generation to destroy a people. If you have a generation of kids growing up and they have been indoctrinated into woke, and now they are being cretinized by DEI procedures, one of whose effects is to put completely incompetent people like Jason Arday in charge of their education. Those children now have missed that chance for an education. Yeah. And unless they are black, unless they are exponents of woke, they're not going to get a job that they might have expected to get because they're not qualified for anything else. They haven't been taught to think critically. Quite the opposite. They've been taught to become acolytes of woke. And that's
Simon, I think there's a considerable consensus that woke is destructive of our societies. You've pointed out very eloquently the injustices of DEI, EDI. But I do want to draw you back to the two X posts that I mentioned about,
Yes, okay.
and to bring you back onto the because this is very, very controversial stuff, and you seemed at one point to be about to say, and I'd like you, if you were, to continue saying it, that well, let's goes to the heart of, let's not beat around the bush, that black people don't get more intelligent by living in European societies, in Western societies, and that this is therefore a social problem. That's why you used this very, if I may say so, at least on the face of it, inflammatory phrase that Africans are pack animals.
Yeah.
Perhaps you'd like to develop that, your line of thinking on that.
Yes. I think I started thinking about that in relation to, well, a number of things. First of all, I've been living in China for 3 years. I've just come back to London. I live in South London on a council estate. My wife and I have a leasehold here, and it is kind of 90% black now. And there's this huge flood of Africans coming into our country. It is no longer the Caribbean community. It's got this African one. So one of it is my experience of simply walking around London again and seeing how much it's changed. A lot of people in the UK, across Europe, are boiled frogs. The boiled frog theory they don't notice having. Because I've been away and I come back, I see these enormous quantitative, but also qualitative changes as well. The quantitative affecting the qualitative change. So first of all, it's an experience of walking around London and seeing packs of African men walking around. That's why the rape level in the UK is now the rape capital of the developed world. It's behind places like South Africa, but of the Western world, it's the rape capital. But the other reason I came up with this phrase, which is deliberately provocative. It's provocative because I'm fed up, and I think we all are, and as my readers were, with having to beat around the bush when we're talking about the effects of mass immigration from non-European countries into the UK and across Europe. We are tired of mincing our words, having our words controlled and our thoughts controlled by woke. The real reason I came up with it is because the response that I saw on social media, but also in this vigil for Jason Arday. Jason Arday is a criminal, without a shadow of a doubt, in my point. He would have to go through the procedure, which is to establish that his guilt, but he was definitely engaging in criminal activity. And in the UK, as in the US, we have a habit of the black community, if I can call it that, though I don't see much community among them, but the black population turning criminals into heroes.
Yeah.
This is what they try to do with
George Floyd.
Yes, with Floyd, and we had to go, I can't remember their names now.
O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson.
That's another one, yeah. We had one here called Chris Carver, I think himself. He was shot by some police, and everyone came out and said and it turned out he was planning to murder someone that night. These are all criminals. Now, Jason Arday isn't that level of criminal. He's a different type of criminal, but he definitely was a criminal. He got caught, he killed himself, and everyone's now trying to turn him into some sort of martyr. They already have. Now, the language they used here was the language which has been inherited from the kind of the black rights movement of the 60s in the US, that he was lynched, that he was killed by, the far right, which I guess includes all of us nowadays. But what I found very interesting was that I think there was one exception I saw. Every black, so Caribbean or African, in genetic terms, it's the same thing, person in the UK who had any kind of public voice, whether they were a politician, simply a talking head, a journalist, or actually someone very senior, like heads of schools at Cambridge and Oxford, very senior people, or even lawyers and judges themselves, they all came out with the same response. Yeah. This man was killed by the far right. He is a hero. He is a martyr, and so on and so forth.
Has there not been a single black? What about Trevor Phillips, for instance, the now TV presenter?
He is one of these people who occasionally comes out and says, kind of stands outside the kind of the fold, doesn't he? I haven't heard what he said about this actually. I think he's probably kept his head down because he wants to keep his head, I imagine. Yes, of course there are exceptions. Someone said to me once, "What about the exceptions?" The exceptions are not my concern.
Yeah,
I'm concerned with the pack, the collective mind, which woke creates. Woke is a collective, is a kind of a pack.
Yeah, but isn't that in this very specific example, white people are acting this way?
Yes, this is what woke does. Woke is not only It's not only an ideology of cretinization; it lowers IQ levels. Woke is funny. Its greatest phrase is critical thought. You know, all the people who are indoctrinated by woke
It's
are
anything
indoctrinated,
but.
but it's actually the opposite of critical thought.
Anything but.
It's the negation of critical thought. It creates a kind of a pack mentality. People walk around and they have a kind of a collective response to things, and they do it through another kind of term that woke uses, and which has been taken over by kind of Black Lives Matter and all that sort of stuff, and that is my truth.
Yeah.
There is no longer an objective truth anymore. There is only my truth. Now, my truth is the truth that protects my tribal grouping. It protects my people. It protects my identity, my collective identity, and that's the truth that matters. So for all the black people in England, their truth was the truth that bound them to Jason Arday because he was black. They didn't think critically. They didn't subject him to any of the criteria that anyone else would have if they were white. Did he commit a crime? Did he plagiarize other people's work? Or his students? Was he a liar? They didn't subject it all that. They simply said, he's black, therefore he's right.
But Simon, you're talking about packs, and
yes.
Peter's question was, or Peter's remark just now was, that the whites are doing this. In fact, Peter, you've made this remark now twice in our broadcast.
Yeah. Okay,
you, Simon, said the pack is woke. Woke creates a pack.
Yeah.
So is the pack woke people or is it blacks?
Well, I use the term pack because I was going back to the inheritance, the genetic inheritance of African mentality and culture. Now, there's 49 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's over 3,000 tribes. Now, most of the allegiances of the sub-Saharan Africans is not to their countries, because the countries are actually created by European settlers and colonialists who do these lines across Africa. Nations don't mean much to them. It's the tribal allegiances, and still in sub-Saharan Africa, tribal leaders have enormous power in negotiating between their people and the national governments. They distribute land, they have enormous authority.
Simon, the number of Africans I've met in the last 20 years, and I have not lived in America, I have asked at social occasion, meetings, whatever, where are you from? 99% of the time they say Africa. They never say a country.
Yes. Yeah.
They never say, they say Africa. That's how they look. I've always found that very interesting.
Yeah. The nation state is not, it's a European invention.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply to Africa at all. Now, why do Africans live in tribes? Well, historically, because they live in a very dangerous country. The danger comes obviously from wild animals. That's less now. The wild animals are on plantations, but they're definitely under threat from other rival tribes. When you move Africans into the UK, and I know this very well because I live in London, which is the centre of the black diaspora here, if you want to call it the black population, you very rarely see Africans moving around in individuals. They move around in packs. They move around in the gang, the young black gang, of which there are many in London and across the UK, is, I think, the kind of the European model. It transfers the kind of the hunting pack of Africa into a European context. I also noticed that you very rarely see African people alone with their thoughts. You don't see them sitting on a train reading a book. They almost always have these in their ears, but much bigger ones. I'm very struck that Africans don't sit alone. You don't see two African guys sitting in a pub having a conversation. African men and women, if they go shopping or something, they travel in packs. Now, partly that's, I guess, for their safety, although they certainly got threatened from us, but probably from their other packs. London at the moment is devolving, or has devolved. You see things that I wouldn't even see 30 years ago. You have tribal packs or gangs of Zimbabweans, of Nigerians, of what's the other kind of groupings? Somalians in particular, who are fighting on the streets with machetes quite openly.
Yeah,
gangs of them swinging at each other with machetes. I never saw a machete. I used to live in Australia and I saw them there, but now they're on the streets of London all over the place. And these gangs are fighting for the rights over the street, to the drugs, to the prostitution of our children. They're fighting this out, and our police are simply sitting back and watching them. They're also fighting it out with the South Asian Muslim gangs as well. Again, I repeat, a lot of these Africans come from countries which are themselves are Muslims. Muslims again are pack animals in the sense that when if you ask them any question, they'll refer to their Bible, to the Quran. The Quran authorizes the raping of young white children, and therefore it's correct. They believe in Sharia law. Africans don't have those laws, but they act in a pack mentality. And to their great shame, the most, how do you want to put it, the most intelligent, if you like, the most westernized, the most Europeanized, the people who have benefited most from our country, the black Africans who have come here and who have advanced to become politicians or civil servants or journalists or lawyers or professors or lecturers, they let all of that go. None of that mattered. And they all were reduced to pack animals. And they all went out and claimed that a liar, a fantasist, a cheat, a fraud, and a criminal was somehow turned into something else. And yes, Peter's absolutely right. Woke is doing the same thing. This is why the woke mentality and the mentality, the genetic mentality of Africans and of the, if you like, ideology of Muslims is making this unholy mix of pack mentality. Now, pack mentality is not the way that Europeans think. We organize our society around the family, around the community, the village, and around nationalities, particularly in Europe.
And again, around law.
And around law, the things that we create from that.
Right.
Now, usually that gives us a power, a strength, a defense against pack mentalities. If people come into the country and start behaving in pack mentalities, whether that organized crime or simply gangs of kids running around waving machetes, we use the law, we use our greater technology, we use our greater organization to control those, to expel it, and to defend our people. That's not happening now, because in Britain, and I think more and more across the West, we're not living in advanced societies anymore. We're living in societies in which the pack mentality is increasingly determining not only our social structures is the wrong word, our social interactions with each other, which is now guided by threats, violence, and pack mentality, but through DEI or EDI in the UK, it's infiltrated into our laws, our policing, our governance, and our education, and of course our culture as well.
You know, I think I said this, John, when we were discussing having Simon on. I pointed out in many of the things that we've already mentioned that just simply not possible in Russia. Okay, there are large immigrant communities in Russia, but they don't, in the same way that Simon is characterized them, in pack. They may live in tight-knit communities, and that may be for protection or cultural familiarity. But there are no machetes going on here, okay? And the law is hard and swift. You break the law, or as I've always said, you don't want to get into the Russian criminal justice system. Because once you're in, it's really, really hard to get out, okay? And there are huge consequences. It's put into your passport, and you have to carry papers. Okay.
I think there are surely at least two explanations for that. Firstly, immigrants in Russia are, by and large, are they not, from former Soviet and before that Russian imperial lands? Now, okay,
there's familiarity.
We could say for Britain that Nigeria and so on, Somalia, these places were also our colonies. But of course, it was different because those territories and peoples, they were integrated into the Russian state. Weren't they? Whereas our colonies were, of course, simply colonies. They were a long way away and they were never absorbed into the British state. So they never, if you like, there was never any state process of assimilation. So they are, in a sense, less foreign. And secondly, the state, and this surely is Simon's key point, is very powerful in Russia. It has, or at least that's how we see it from the outside. It, there's a boss, you do what the boss says.
Well, I mean, there's the phrase, John, you know the phrase power vertical. You know that phrase.
Yeah.
Okay. And people like it.
Yeah. And Simon's point is that the woke ideology, plus immigration, plus cretinization, all these things have corroded. I'm sure this is your view, Simon. You'll develop it if it is. Have corroded and indeed destroyed the operation of the British state. Simon.
Yes, well, in the sense that the British state is meant to defend and, well, first of all, to represent the government is meant to represent the will, to a certain extent, of the British people. That's because we elect it. And the state, its first job, as we keep on being reminded, is to protect the interests, but also the self-safety and the security of the British people who comprise the British state. The trouble is, the British state is no longer made up of British people. We make up, I reckon there's about 43 million white British, which is to say British people left in the UK.
Total population of?
Out of a population of 70 million.
Okay.
There's about 13 million immigrants from non-European countries. There's about sort of 2.7 from the US and other places, and there's about 11 or 12 million African and Asian second generations of people who are born here, who, as we can see, have got absolutely no allegiance to us at all. So there's about 43 million of us left. We at the moment have a birth rate of about 1.39 per woman, which means by the next generation, there's going to be 30 million of us. But the actual taking over of the British state, I keep on talking about this as a future event. One of the things I've been convinced of now that I've come back to the UK, and I've been here about 3 months now, is that the invasion has happened.
Yes.
In my opinion, we are already an occupied country.
Yes.
The British state is quite clearly not only not intent on defending us or representing us, but it's intent on destroying us. At the moment, it has been going on for a long time. It's a process of ethnocide. But ultimately, I see it going into a process of genocide. I think we're simply going to be bred out of existence or turned into such a minority that we don't really matter anyway. At the moment, in terms of our culture and our political representation, white people in England have absolutely no say at all in the governance of this state. Worse than that, the state itself is trying to destroy us. That's my real concern.
Why would they do that? I mean, because it would seem to me, I think all three of us are very cynical about the ruling elites in the West right now and the huge income differential that we see with the 1% or 1.01% and all of that. Is it to their advantage? I mean, they're more interested in maintaining their wealth and passing it on to their descendants more than the survival of the state. I mean, have they given up on, what I'm just saying is that the most powerful, richest people in Western societies, have they given up? Okay, because they certainly would have the resources. You know how easy it is to buy a politician these days.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what is their mindset? As long as it maintains their personal status quo, I mean, these people don't seem to have any kind of ideology, which is an interesting statement in itself for a ruling elite. And we look at global history. They don't seem to be attached to anything more than their own self-interest in their very small a group of the people that have the same level of influence.
If you're talking about the sort of the upper middle classes, the wealthy people who do have voices and do sort of, they could get up and speak about this and make a fuss, I think they're just leaving. The middle classes are fleeing the UK and Europe in general in enormous numbers. But if you're talking about the global elite, as they've kind of branded themselves now, this is the question I try to answer in my book. Islam is, if you're looking for a country, a state, in which there is an absolute authority over the people, which has religious backing, in which the economic inequality is greater than almost any other countries in the world, and in which the middle class effectively being kind of hollowed out. Somewhere like Pakistan, there's almost nobody pays any taxes at all. In other words, if you're looking for a kind of a dictatorship over an utterly subservient people, Islam is your ideology of choice. It has been for 50 countries around the world, of which 47 are categorized as dictatorships. And the global elite, I think, have chosen it to conquer Europe. Now, this is slightly different from the question of immigration because the immigration into the UK comes from sub-Saharan Africa, but also from India, which of course has 227 million Muslims in it, so it's a huge Muslim population, Bangladesh and Pakistan. Africans don't run things. We've seen this in the countries in sub-Saharan Africa where white governments have been, kind of in South Africa, in the former Rhodesia in the Congo, in Zimbabwe and so on. They don't know how to run their own countries. They kind of descend into chaos. South Africa is going into an appalling state now, where the entire infrastructure is kind of falling away. But Muslims do know how to run countries, and they know how to conquer them as well. What I see is something like, not somewhere like the Sudan, for instance, which is an Islamic state with an African population. That's England's never going to get, well, Britain's never going to get quite to that, but that seems to me to be a model, an absolute dictatorship enforced by religious dogma, in which women have absolutely no status at all outside of the home, and in which we live as dhimmis. So the black mentality, the genetically determined culture and mentality of African people, why else is, let me look at the figures. There's 675,000 Nigerians in the UK, 250,000 Somalis, nearly the same number of Ghanaians, 200,000 Zimbabweans, 50,000 Sudanese. There's 1.2 million Caribbeans. Why? Why does a country like the UK, with the way we produce our wealth, what possible use can we have for these people? There is only one use, and that is to destroy us and to breed us out of existence. I think we're a very long way behind in these conversations in recognizing the seriousness of what's happening.
Well, I mean, one of the stories, or even myths, if we want to call it that, is that people go from poor countries in Africa, from the Muslim world, they go to America, they go to the opportunity, and there's the rule of law, all of these things here. And what you're saying is that that's not what attracts them. So what attracts them to go to the UK?
Well, the UK is the wealth of the UK, of the British people, because it's the British people who pay taxes. Oh, the only, if you break down the racial contribution to the exchequer, only white people make a contribution to the UK exchequer. They come here for our money, because when they come here, they get benefits. They get 3 to 4 children who are raised on child benefit. They get free housing. They have all our social housing. I'm not talking about the so-called refugees who come here being put up in hotels. All the social housing that's being built at the moment is being built for immigrants. Yeah. They're not working. John challenged me on this when we first talked about this a couple of years ago, and I came out with my kind of economic model. And he said, "But Simon, there's just not enough jobs in the UK for these number of people." And he's right. There's not even close to it. They're not working. They didn't come here to work. They're not here to make us wealthier. They're here to, and effectively, expropriate the British people of our wealth. Mm. They're going to take our homes, our savings, our land, our assets. They're going to run the country down. And when a country is not, sorry, when a country
I don't want to be
down,
too contrarian, but why don't white Britons say no? I mean,
that's the big question.
I'll take all of your statistics at face value. Then what's wrong with white Britons? What's wrong with them?
The program.
They've been propagandized by woke. I mean, and I'm not going to disagree with you on that. It seems like a problem that can be solved here if there is political will.
Yes.
Simon, you have the last word, and then we'll wrap up.
The countries in Europe that have been targeted for replacement migration, this is the UN policy published in 2000, are the wealthiest countries. It's Germany, it's France, it's the UK, to a lesser extent it's Spain, although we're seeing that's kicking off now, and Italy. The reason they've done that is because they're the only countries who can afford to take in this number of immigrants. This is a deliberate drain. It's not about contributing to our economy. It's not making about poor people richer. It's about destroying those countries by sucking up that money. We need to understand this not as a, something that's out of our control, something that's gone wrong, a problem, a failure of vision. Someone did think of this, someone did visualize this, and now it's being put into practice. And Jason Arday and his suicide and his crimes is a tiny little peephole into how it's being done, but also what its goal is. And its goal is our destruction.
The Jason Arday story is sometimes compared to the Emperor's New Clothes, isn't it? Where people are caught up in an illusion, and they pile in on the illusion because they don't want themselves to be, looked down on or whatever. And so the illusion continues. And as we all know, the little boy pipes up in the crowd and said the Emperor has no clothes. But what you're saying, Simon, is that even if somebody were to pipe up, then that person would be piped down, and the illusion would continue. Simon, you've given us a very, very somber, you've given us a very somber portrait, but it's difficult to disagree with your analysis. Thank you very much for being with us, Simon.
Thank you, John. Thank you,
Thanks,
Peter.
Simon.